Who here has heard of Becky Trueblood? A couple, only a couple. I'm quite surprised. She was part of a rather famous singing group, maybe a decade back, the Heritage Singers. No? I was quite a fan. In Papua New Guinea, they were very famous, a few people up the back. I confess, she was my, a better word, idol, heroine growing up. Becky Trueblood. She was, I think, their alto singer. Beautiful young woman. Not only, though, was she this famous singer, which I had planned to be, didn't quite get there, she also had entered the Miss America pageant. Now, she didn't become Miss America, but she did become Miss Idaho. And she'd written this book, and I read and reread that book so many times as a young girl growing up. It's like she had the best combo, like a beauty queen pageant and this singer for God, and I just thought, wow, could it get any better than that? And you know, when I think about the story of Esther growing up, I don't know about you, but I had my Uncle Arthur Bible story kind of things, the blue books and the red ones. And that was kind of the idea I had of Queen Esther and her whole coming to the palace thing. I just kind of had this mixture fairy tale kind of view of her being in like a pageant and being paraded with all these other beautiful women. And of course, she's the most beautiful one and is picked and then becomes queen, and it's just, you know, amazing. And that was my view. And I guess for a child, that is the appropriate kind of version of the story. But as you grow up and as you read the story and you start to see that there's a little bit more to it than that. There's a few more other implications, really, to being summoned to the palace of a pagan king with all the other virgins and being in a competition to be chosen. And so, as you look at the story, with all of that, with all those implications, there comes a fair bit of depth. And so when I was thinking about sharing for the next two Sabbaths, I thought, yeah, let's do Esther. And then I got to studying and I went, wow, it's even more amazing than I thought. So this is a two-part series. Today we're going to be looking at it through Esther's eyes, the whole story. And next week we're going to be looking at it from Mordecai's angle. So two different kind of versions. And there is some amazing things in this story that God has for us. If you're not familiar with Esther, let me just give you a brief synopsis. Esther is a young woman living in Persia. Persia is like the world empire of the time, and she's Jewish. She's one of the Jewish diaspora living in there still. Many of her other fellow Jews have already gone back to Palestine to rebuild, but she's stayed there. So she's living in this foreign country. Persia is affluent. At this point in time in history, it's at its peak. It's actually after this that it starts to decline, because right here at the beginning of the story of Esther, Xerxes, the king at the time, and his fourth since Cyrus, who took over from Babylon, great-grandson, he's looking after things, and he's just held this 6-month feast. 6 months of feasting, where he's invited all his nobles, all his governors, and they've all been invited to the palace to feast. And it says, we'll read it in a minute, there was no holds barred. Anyone could have as much as they wanted for as long as they liked. And then at the end of the 6-month feast, he opens it up to the entire city. Young, old, rich, poor are all invited to the palace, and they can have as much wine, as much anything as they want. It is an extravagant place to live. But what happens in the story is that Vashti, the current queen, is summoned during this banquet. The king's a little high, and he says, oh, well, I want my queen to come and be displayed in front of everyone. And we don't have details, but she, whatever the case is, and for whatever reason, she refuses. And so he gets into a rage. His advisors step in. There seems to be a bit of manipulation going on, which we'll explore next week. But they kind of say, well, let's get rid of her, and that'll be done with it. So off she goes, just like that, and the story continues. I guess we don't know how long after, but Xerxes kind of has a bit of a conscience kick in. He probably sobers up a bit and goes, oh, what have I done? And the advisors, I guess, then go, oh no, she can't come back, because if she comes back, we're gone. So they said, well, king, let's just gather all the virgins and you can take your pick. And Xerxes says, well, that's an amazing idea, yes. And that's where we pick up the story. Esther is this Jewish girl. She must be stunning. And she's one of the girls taken to the palace. And just before she goes, though, Mordecai, who's her cousin, has raised her. Her parents died young. Mordecai says, when you go to the palace, don't tell them you're Jewish. Keep it a secret. And she's like, okay, and off they go. And it's just a sentence. And again, I guess I grew up with the story, and that was just part of it, and I never really thought much about it. But just think about the implications of what he just asked her to do for a Jewish girl. Don't tell them you're Jewish. To conceal her Jewish identity meant that, unlike Daniel, who was also taken captive in a pagan palace, she would have had to have eaten anything given her, kosher or not. From the king's table, offered to idols, whatever, she would just have to eat it. To conceal her Jewish identity, she wouldn't have been able to keep Sabbath, not like the Torah would say, nor any of really the many other laws that you looked after when you were Jewish. And then the whole audience with the king. What do you do with that? This story has really had theologians, Jewish rabbis, especially I guess Jewish rabbis, they've kind of scratched their head a bit, and what do we do with it? Because she's our heroine. But according to some Jewish rabbis, really for a proper Jewish girl, for her to be proper, she should have kind of preferred death over an audience with a king of that sort, a pagan king. And then, not just that, to even marry a pagan, that in itself was completely against the law. And it was at that time, or around that time, that Ezra, working to rebuild Israel, was actually fighting that one issue, intermarriage between pagans and Jews. He was like, no, you can't do it. That's it. So we have this heroine at at Mordecai's request, breaking, by implication, breaking these laws. I guess there's a 0.1% chance that she may have been able to just do it really carefully. But I'd be in a communal setting, like a harem. I don't think that's possible. And it gives an interesting spin, I guess, on the story. And it's interesting then that when you're reading the book, and because it's a 10-chapter story, I'm not reading all of it, I'm kind of telling you, but I'd encourage you to read the 10 chapters again as a whole. It's a great read. It's interesting that the author doesn't give us any moral judgment on it. There is no comment given for or against from a moral stance. And nor are we even given any real idea of how Esther thought, how she felt. What did she feel about this? Where really was she sitting? We just are left with no indication at all from the text. And this has caused, as I said, struggle theologically in theological circles. What do you do with a heroine who so blatantly breaks so many Jewish laws? You pin her up against Daniel, who just stood up for what was right, because that's what you do. And Joseph, also in a pagan household, who says no to sexual advances and pays the price for it. For me, it's one of the things I appreciate about the book. Her story, the situation that she finds herself in, is not one that is simple or clear-cut. It's a morally ambiguous and complex situation where simple answers are not possible. It's the way real life is in a fallen world, and the author doesn't hide it. You know, it's easy to look at other situations, other people's situations, and judge and say yay or nay to decisions they make. And it's easy to talk about ethical and moral issues in an abstract, theoretical way, because then you can create simple parameters. Theories allow for simplicity. But then life happens and it's rarely simple. It isn't always neat and tidy. There is definitely black and there is definitely white. I'm not throwing it all out. But there's also grey. And sometimes we can find ourselves in situations where right and wrong are not so clearly defined. And every choice we have seems to be like a troubling mixture of the both. We pray, we sincerely search Scripture, sincerely looking for God's will in sometimes situations that the Bible may not fully, definitely address. And all the while we're doing this, life happens and decisions are made. Sometimes, whether we like it or not, it just happens, even by default. And it is here, it is there, in the grey complexity of life, that I draw encouragement from this particular aspect of Esther. Esther was a very real human with very real flaws, and God was with her. God was working in her. God was working through her, right there in her flaws. There were no angels left standing outside that pagan palace because they couldn't get in with her. God was with her inside the pagan palace, as I'm sure many angels were too, the whole time. It says a lot about our God. I really appreciate how a particular commentary put it. It's a rather large chunk, and I tried to actually make it so I'm saying it, but I couldn't say it any better, so I'm just going to read it to you. Sorry, I gave you all these pictures and completely forgot. That's Esther. And this is from the NIV application commentary. It says, this episode from Esther's life offers great encouragement and comfort when we find ourselves in situations where every choice is an odd mix of right and wrong. Only God knows the end of our story from the beginning. We are responsible to Him for living faithfully in obedience to His word in every situation as best we know how. Even if we make the wrong decision, through innocent blunder or deliberate disobedience, our God is so gracious and omnipotent that He is able to use that weak link in a chain of events that will perfect His purposes in us and through us. Esther may have looked back on this episode of her life with shame and regret, or she may have looked back on it with a clear conscience, knowing that she acted as wisely as she knew how at the time. In either case, every one of us also has both kinds of episodes in our lives. Esther's story shows that we can entrust them to Him, to the Lord, and move on. And I thought that was very powerful, because it's true. We all have those times. So having already established that we really don't know what Esther thought or where she was actually at that point in time, I've still wondered, I've still speculated. Who was Esther? What was she like? And I've wondered if perhaps she wasn't as Jewish as maybe her forefathers were. She was part of the Jewish diaspora who had chosen to remain in that pagan capital rather than returning home with the other exiles when they were given opportunity to under Cyrus. And from historical records, it was an incredible place to live. I was searching, this is from a movie, I guess, but I wanted to try to give some idea of the grandeur, because we so often think back to, I guess, old times, and it's just, I don't know, mud, brick and whatever, but it wasn't. It was an amazing place to live. And probably not unlike our Western affluence today. You know, there was no hard manual labour for her and the others who decided to stay. They didn't have to rebuild the walls, they didn't have to fight off terrorists or anything like that. They got to live in this beautiful city with good jobs, with a slightly erratic king, but hey, he's in the palace and life just goes on in a very multicultural, I would say postmodern for back then, kind of city. And when you start the book of Esther, it's almost like the author wants us to really understand. I was going to read through it, but I won't for time. But he gives a description of the palace right in chapter 1 in great detail of just how amazing it was, right down to the fact that the floor was built of precious stones and incredible pillars and stuff that we can't even imagine today. Buckingham Palace is nothing on what they had. It was pretty amazing. And so I wonder, perhaps, if Esther even enjoyed living in Persia. And maybe, what if she actually liked the idea of having a chance at the throne? You know, she may not have been this secluded little Jewish girl who never got out. She could have been just this, you know, kind of Jewish but kind of Persian, bit of both, young girl that went, wow, queen, and a whole year of beauty treatment. We don't know, and I'm not being disrespectful, I don't mean to be. But what if she was that mix? She was Jewish, no mistake, but what if she was a bit Persian too? You know, it's hard to live in a world, but not of it. How do you maintain your integrity of faith when your entire environment kind of pushes you always the opposite way? Always. Especially when you're born into a faith. Like many of us, you know. You can be born into something and it can be you. But is it really you? And I wonder, was she born into it? And of course she was Jewish, but was she? I wonder if, as the generations marched down the years, if perhaps the fire and integrity kind of dwindled a bit in the diaspora Jews living in Persia. I mean, they were still Jewish for sure. I bet they went to the synagogue every Saturday, you know, and they held the feasts, and for the most part probably married each other, you know, that was their thing. But I wonder how much really remained deep inside. I wonder how easy it was for Mordecai to say, don't tell them you're Jewish, and for Esther to obey. And God was with her, watching over her, even as she masked her Jewish identity. And he was with his people, watching over them, even when they had refused to go back to their land when he'd given them opportunity to. What an amazing God he is. It says a lot about God. And so she enters the palace. This is all that stuff we didn't read. She enters the palace as queen, a secret Jew living a pagan life. But the day comes when she is called on to make a decision, as it does for all of us. God loves us. He is with us. But at one point or another in our life, we too have to make a decision whether we are actually His, whether we take a stand for Him, whether we take Him seriously, the identity He's provided for us. For Esther, it comes when the wicked Haman, which we'll learn more about next week, he devises this wicked plot, a little bit like Hitler, because it's genocide for all the Jews. And so suddenly she, as queen, is thrust into this political arena where her whole race is about to be annihilated. And so Mordecai sends her a message in Esther chapter 4, verse 5. And we're going to read that. I invite you to open your Bibles. I should have invited you to open them before, I'm sorry. Esther, right after Nehemiah, it's a very small book, chapter 4, verse 5. I have trouble finding it, so it's about there. It's tiny. You flip over it. Esther chapter 4, verse 5, and it's up here. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. This is the pivotal point in the story for Esther, not her coronation, though I'm sure she had thought her coronation was. But again, I love, she doesn't jump at this straight away. She's not like, "Sure, I'll do it." She says no first. She is as human as you can be. And she said no for good reason. There was no prophecy guaranteeing her personal safety. There was no word from God saying, "Yes, go in because everything's going to be fine." She had nothing like that. She didn't know what was going to happen. And that king had already deposed her predecessor for taking initiative. So it was highly likely that that would happen. She had no certainty of the outcome. And it's not unlike us. Because like us, she couldn't see the happy ending from that confused, painful, scary middle. Like us, she had principles to guide her in a world where evil could take her out, whether she followed them or not. But 3 days of fasting passes, and she goes into the king. And the reception is amazing, because we know the end of the story. He says, "I'll give you half my kingdom. You're so amazing." And from there, the story finishes with her saving her people. And it's an amazing happy ending. But just before we finish, because I love finishing on a happy ending, there's one last point I want us to see, because I think this is perhaps the most profound. Esther had to overcome herself in order to do what God had created her and positioned her to do. Because when you look at it, up until this point in the story, though she has been queen and I'm sure has felt like she's in control and everything's going her way and is safe, really she's been passive. And she's at the mercy of a ruler who could take her out at any time. Any time. She has an illusion of grandeur, an illusion of security. But it is just that. It's an illusion. And I think about our lives today, and we too can live in those same sort of illusions. Illusions of stable jobs, affluence, great health, we're in control, we've got stuff, and that can become our security. And we're kind of Jews, but not really. We're in our safe place, and it's hard to pull away from that. It's hard to say, I'm going to risk all of that, I'm going to lay that down, because it can seem like being the Queen of Persia, amazing and safe. But just like Esther, there is a ruler who has ways of stepping in and taking us out anytime he wants. Those things can go like that. And really, we're just living lives without any impact unless we take a stand and really give our lives to God. When Esther actually laid down everything by going into that chamber and approaching the king, risking her life, she then became the one who made the decisions. She then became the one who faced off Haman, the worst person in the story, like the big bad bully. She had this incredible strength suddenly that made her just decisive, strategic. She becomes a politician that just knows what she's doing. She devises a whole strategy of taking him out, exposing him. And then she gives Mordecai instructions on what to do for the rest of it, the cleanup operation. When she lets go of herself and gives herself entirely into God's hands, she is transformed. And it's no different for us. Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." Like Esther, it's easy to live in a false sense of security. We have safety, we have affluence, relative affluence. But really, it's nothing compared to what we have in God. And standing up for our faith, really being a Christian, can feel incredibly risky. We want to clutch onto our money, our time, our things. But it is an illusion. It can be ripped away very fast. The enemy wants us to think that we're in control. But really, He is, unless we give our control to God. When we give our lives fully into God's hands, ironically, like Esther, it's then we're most empowered. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this.